How's it going, YouTube? Welcome to the channel. My name is Corey, and today we're going to go over the new Dominus cycle that is coming in Phyrexia All Will Be One. This is a quintet of Phyrexian horrors that have very powerful implications for both the Commander and the historic Brawl formats. So let's get acquainted with them because you are going to see them a lot. Let's start with what is possibly the strongest of the entire cycle, the White Dominus, Mondrak Glory Dominus. For 2 white, you get a legendary creature Phyrexian horror that says if one or more tokens will be created under your control, twice that many are created instead. And it has an activated ability of a colorless and 2 white Phyrexian mana, sacrifice 2 other artifacts and or creatures, put an indestructible counter on Mondrak Glory Dominus, and the Phyrexian mana can be paid with either a white or 2 life, and it's a 4/4. Token doublers are extremely powerful in Magic the Gathering, but are usually relegated to being some sort of enchantment. Well, enter Mondrak and its multiple tooth-filled maws that somehow equate to an anointed procession as a creature. Mondrak, though, has a big upside in that you can use its activated ability to sacrifice some fodder to make itself indestructible, and can also be used just as a recurring sacrifice engine, unlike the Anointed Procession. And it can also sit in the command zone, giving you a recurring access to this effect whenever you need it. So what kind of cards do you want to play with Mondrak? Well, that would depend on whether it's in the command zone or as part of the 99 of the deck. Some cards obviously will cross over with white, such as the aforementioned Anointed Procession, because duplication of the effect increases consistency in the deck. But an enchantment such as Rabble Rousing is another great card to include, which will just start to overwhelm your opponent before too long. Or maybe you just want to go with something that can surprise your opponent, such as Decree of Justice. Decree has always been more about the cycling part than the hard cast due to it being instant speed and being really hard to stop. And Mondrak in turn doubles up the soldiers created off of the trigger for cycling. And if you actually get a chance to hard cast it, it'll be a blowout with Mondrak around, but don't count on that happening too often. But what can we do when we shift Mondrak to the 99 and start slotting in other colors? Well, let's start with blue. This thing has the upside of being clonable by some of our favorite spells, such as Spark Double and Irenicus's Vile Duplication. The fun part with duplication is, though, you get 2 copies of Mondrak because it creates a token copy, and the first Mondrak will actually duplicate the token of it created with the Vile Duplication. And then further down in the game, you can actually then start cloning the non-legendary copies with other cloning spells, including the brand new Blade of Shared Souls, which is coming in the set as well, turning a 2/2 Rebel token into another copy of Mondrak just to make sure you have a non-legendary copy around first. But all this cloning does come with a little bit of a caveat. Just bear in mind, those clones do not retain the indestructibility of what is cloned because it's a counter that remains on the original copy of Mondrak. You'll have to pay up for additional activations to put indestructible on the clones, but that shouldn't be too hard because with all the tokens that this deck is going to be spitting out, you're going to have plenty of things to sacrifice. Or maybe we go green instead of blue. This would let us have access to additional token doublers like Parallel Lives or Second Harvest. It would also allow us to use creature tutoring effects like Congregation at Dawn, Aladdin's Call, and the much less played Altar of Bone as ways to get Mondrak down as a secret commander for the deck. I'm already planning to try to do something with a white-blue-green variation on this deck, maybe using Rigo Streetwise Mentor to synergize with the card draw triggers, and then get the best of both the blue and the green to add to the white and push Mondrak's triggers as hard and far as we can. But I'm also going to try the mono white version just to see how it goes. The next Dominus is Drivnod Carnage Dominus. For 3 black, we get a legendary creature, Phyrexian Horror, that says if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it triggers an additional time. And for 2 black Phyrexian mana, and exiling 3 creatures from our graveyard, you can put an indestructible counter on it, and then again, the Phyrexian mana can be paid with black or 2 life, and it's an 8/3. This Dominus features an ability that has only appeared on one other card in Magic the Gathering's history, Teysa Karlov from Ravnica Allegiant. Drivnod is kind of a mono-black version of that card, and is able to copy death triggers on all of our creatures. On top of that, for 2 black Phyrexian mana and exiling 3 creatures from our graveyard, it gains the indestructible just like Mondrak, giving us a beefy 8/3 beater that can't die in combat. So what do we want in a deck centered around Drivnod? Well, obviously, death trigger creatures. Well, what has death triggers in mono black that we would want? Well, maybe like one of the best cards ever printed, Blood Artist. The artist and creatures similar affected like Zulport Cutthroat can now go off in double time with every creature that dies in combat gets removed or sacrificed to further your plans of damaging your opponent out of the game and padding your life total at the same time. If that's not interesting enough, let's look at Black Market. Every dying creature puts 2 counters on it, giving you a huge mana burst on your next turn. Or maybe Grave Pact if you're going to go for being the arch enemy of the board, where every time one of your creatures dies, your opponents are going to lose 2 creatures for every one that you're losing, especially as long as Drivnod is lording over the board. Make the battlefield a real no man's land by playing Dictate of Erebos and Butcher of Malakir as well. And no, this isn't being too mean. Just be sure it's not a surprise to your pod when you're dropping these kind of cards on the board, so there's no friction in the game later. And if you're looking for better card advantage, could I interest you in Grim Haruspex? Sacrifice a fodder creature like a reassembling skeleton, draw 2 cards each time, and just bring it back to do it over and over again. This also works with Midnight Reaper as well, but that's also going to cost you 2 life per non-token creature dying as you go along. But that circles us back. What other deck would want to do this if having Drivnod in the 99? Well, the only deck I would likely play it in is Black-White with Teysa Karlov at the helm, giving us an additional copy of the Death Trigger effect in the deck, and they will stack if you have them both out at the same time. All the above cards I've already mentioned would also go in this deck, but then you also gain access to things like Seraph of the Scales, which has Afterlife, which says you get tokens when they die, so you'll net additional copies of the Afterlife trigger with either one of these out. Or maybe you want to access more Life Drain, and adding white gives us access to Cruel Celebrant. Or maybe we want another legend to leverage all of this death with a Lend to the Desk Rose. She's going to net you double counters on each thing dying, and then when she dies, it's going to give you double tokens off of her own death trigger. The possibilities are quite endless as long as you're willing to dig around and look for these death triggers and these combinations, and I would bet that making a deck with Drivnod in the control spot and Teysa Karlov around eventually will be one of my all-time favorites. Next up is the third Dominus, and likely going to cause me some tongue twisting because I have trouble saying a specific word as part of its abilities. Tekkathal Inquiry Dominus. For 2 blue, you get a legendary creature Phyrexian Horror with flying that says if you would proliferate, there's the hard word, proliferate twice instead, and then you also have an activated ability of 1 and 2 blue Phyrexian mana, remove 3 counters from among artifacts, creatures, and planeswalkers you control, put an indestructible counter on Tekkathal. So hey, I heard you like to proliferate, so they made it so you can proliferate while you're proliferating. All joking aside here, Proliferate is a powerful ability and is heavily pushed in Phyrexia All v1. Here we have a legend that doubles our ability to proliferate. So what can this do with us? Well, the first and probably the most obvious thing we can mess around with is Planeswalker cards, because we can sit there and synergize with Tekkathal's ability to remove counters from our stuff to make itself indestructible, and then with the doubling of proliferations after that, those walkers are going to get right back up to full strength pretty quick. So which ones do we want to be our friend here? Well, I would start with Teferi, Master of Time, because rapidly proliferating him back up is going to mean you're going to be stealing extra turns off of your opponents pretty quickly, and it's probably going to end the game very fast. Teferi's newest incarnation, Temporal Pilgrim, would also be high on my list to put here. Its counters are going to rise quickly, especially with all the proliferating, and if you're doing card draw as well. And then the counters that go on his -2 ability for tokens also can be proliferated as well, making those spirit tokens get big really fast and turning them into really big threats. Maybe we could even go with the newly completed version of Jace, the Perfected Mind. Proliferate a turn or 2, and then you just go around dumping his counters with his -X ability, and you can turbo grind your opponent's deck into the ground. Now, speaking of the proliferation effects here, what do we want to play here? Well, the best proliferate spell in blue is actually an enchantment that doesn't, I can't say it. Proliferate itself, Inexorable Tide. Anything we cast after we drop this into play is going to trigger a proliferation, and then with Tekkathal, it's going to do it again. And then we also have access to a reprint coming in the brand new set, Thrumming Bird. It's simple and just able to put a lot of work in for 2 mana. All you got to do is make sure you connect with one of your opponents and you get a proliferate trigger. We also have a slightly more expensive cousin to the Thrumming Bird, Guildpact Informant. But for that additional mana, we can also hit Planeswalkers and get the proliferate effect as well. Going outside of mono blue, a blue-green deck would probably angle pretty well here for +1/+1 counters and other planeswalkers that are in green and blue as well. We also can expand into other proliferating options such as Rolesk Apex Hybrid, Merfolk Skydiver, Evolution Sage, and probably the most expensive proliferate spell in the entire game, Plane-Wide Celebration, which if you choose to proliferate all 4 times with it, you're gonna get 8 of them with Tekkathal sitting on the board. And going into ultimate territory on planeswalkers after you do that is just about as bad as crater hoofing a board to death. Tekkathal could easily be a strong commander on his own, but like with Mondrak, I think it's gonna be stronger if you pair it with other colors that have more access to other planeswalkers and other +1/+1 counters and poison synergies and stuff like that. I have built a shell, but right now I'm only finding access to maybe about a dozen planeswalkers, so we're gonna see what we can do with that. Getting away from the word I can't say all the time, let's go with the 4th Dominus, Sulfim Mayhem Dominus. For 2 red, you get a legendary creature, Phyrexian Horror, that says if a source you would control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent they control, it deals double that damage instead. And it also has an activated ability of 1 and 2 red Phyrexian mana, and discarding 2 cards, put an indestructible counter on it, and it's a 5/4. So sometimes you just want to see the world burn, and Mayhem Dominus here is going to actually allow us to do that to grand effect, doubling up all of our burn spells, any kind of damage activations on our creatures, triggers off of enchantments, any other kinds of non-combat damage dealt by anything else you control, it's going to get doubled by Sulfim. Now with that said, mono red is a hard color combination to set up on the game, but this might actually make it just good enough to get some good wins out of. One of the things I find really fun here is that you can actually discard cards to make indestructibility happen, but red has a nice spread of madness spells that you might be able to take advantage of and push even more damage ahead when you go to activate it. Things like Avacyn's Judgment, Fiery Temper, Violent Eruption, and once you have him indestructible, you can also play red damage sweepers, which is absolute impunity, such as Star of Extinction, Burn Down the House, or Blasphemous Act, and then Sulfim's not going to die in that conflagration of damage. I also love him with things like Pyrohemia, doubling up the damage that it deals, but as long as he's indestructible, it's not going to destroy Sulfim, and you can just keep blasting away. Or let's make Perforos, the god of the forge, just absolutely stupid, where it's going to deal 4 damage for every creature coming down instead of the 2 that it already does. Or maybe we pair Sulfim with a bunch of smaller guys and Cavalcade of Calamity or Hellrider, turning all the little pokes and prods into shocks for every attacking creature 1 or less with the Calamity, and every creature that swings with a Hellrider on the board is also going to deal a shock's worth of damage as well. I would also consider spells like Increasing Vengeance, Repeated Reverberation, and Double Cast just to be able to copy the burn spells and push the damage up. As an example, using Double Cast and a Lightning Bolt, Sulfim will make that 3 damage deal 6 damage per copy, which is nearly a third of a player's life in Commander and half their life in Historic Brawl. Though in Brawl, you do need to use workarounds to actually get access to a Lightning Bolt. This is the one Dominus creature in here that I feel can head up a deck no problem, doesn't need a second color to maximize it since most direct damage is red, and I will be building the deck very soon for the channel. The 5th and last Dominus, and this is going to probably be a downer of a note here, is Zul'Pandrel Hunger Dominus. For 5 green. You get a legendary creature Phyrexian Horror with Reach. At the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn, and for 2 green Phyrexian mana, sacking 2 other creatures, make it indestructible, and you get a 4/6 creature for the deal. As I said, this is going to be a bit of a downer note because I am about to trash this card. Zul'Pandrel is by far the weakest of this entire cycle, and being more expensive than the rest, if easier to cast version of Unnatural Growth. The only advantage it has over the other Dominus creatures is that sacking 2 creatures isn't a very high bar to clear to gain the indestructibility. Otherwise though, this Dominus is not very exciting in combat. It's an 8/12 at that point off of its own doubling, but it doesn't have trample, but it can sure swat down dragons with ease with that reach. Oh boy. As I said before, if you can't tell by the tone of my voice, I am super disappointed with this Dominus. It's not overly exciting. It's the best thing I can say about it is that it can make Tyrannax Rex, which is also coming in the same set, into a 16/16 with haste and trample. You know, the design was a very big miss when the other big green mythic beater in the set is more attractive than this thing is. I also question that, you know, if I'm already in mono green, why wouldn't I just play Unnatural Growth instead, since it's cheaper to cast and less likely to get blown up or exiled, unlike this thing. The last thing I really don't like about this Dominus is, unlike the other four, it doesn't really encourage you to build around it. The white one, you're all about tokens and ways to make tokens. The black one, you're about leveraging death triggers on your creatures. The red one, you're about burn spells and creatures that deal direct damage. The blue one, you're about proliferation spells and planeswalkers and +1 counters and counters that go on other things. And then you can also lean into like poison or other things that are going on. This thing doesn't really do that. I mean, what do you do as Open Draw? Focus on big creatures so you can make them bigger? I mean, it's not exactly the most impressive thing in the world. We've been there and seen that. But how is that any different than many other better commanders available to mono green, such as Vorinclex Monstrous Raider? I'm not really sure what they could have done here with the green Dominus, but this one is just a complete letdown to me from the rest of the cycle. And I really don't have any recommendations for the deck to be built around. At best, I might slot it into a green deck as a backup copy of Unnatural Growth. So what did you think? Am I too forgiving on some of these cards? Am I, making them sound better than they really are? Am I too harsh on Zopendrel? Let me know in the comments below. Do you agree with the things I've recommended for the 99 and how I would build around those? Let me know that as well. And as always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.